Hello, welcome back. Series 2 of the Rippling Pages podcast. I've got more great writers making waves with the word. It also does mean a bit more of me, but I assure you it will mostly be the writers. Who have I got for the first episode? Japanese literary translator and writer, Polly Barton. After studying philosophy at Cambridge, Polly moved to Japan to teach English. Describing herself as becoming hooked on the Japanese language, she eventually became a translator of novels such as Eiko Matsuda's Where the Wild Ladies Are and Tomoko Shibasaki's Spring Garden. But it's the early experiences in Japan which have formed her own book, 50 Sounds. Not only is 50 Sounds an exploration of the Japanese language, as well as a thorny examination of linguistics, it's a tender journey to discover what it means to feel a sense of belonging in the world. 50 Sounds also won the Fitzcarraldo Essay Prize in 2020, and Polly joined me to discuss that book for the first episode of the Rippling Pages podcast, Series 2. I just wondered if you could start by talking about this idea of 50 Sounds and why it provided a springboard for the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So 50 Sounds is a direct translation of the Japanese word for their syllabary, which is a phonetic alphabet. And it's sort of, I've used that as a springboard, like you say, to frame the whole book. So the book is basically, I kind of think of it as an essay in 50 essays. So it's 50 kind of semi-discrete entries, and each one is based around a particular Japanese word. Just to complicate things even further, it's always funny to speak about this because it ends up sounding so complex, and my aim with it was obviously, although it's a highly conceptual idea, to kind of sneak that in and not make it feel really kind of conceptually difficult. But in introducing it, it's maybe helpful to say that each of these words that I focus on is an onomatopoeic word or a mimetic word. So Japanese has a huge number of mimetic vocabulary. Second in the world, it's thought, after Korean. So it has many, many more than most Indo-European languages. And, I think within English, we have quite a kind of hazy conception of what onomatopoeia is, whereas in Japan, it's much, there's a much clearer sense of what is and what isn't onomatopoeia. Like the mimetic language forms its own kind of word class. In English, we have, say, the word splash or something like that, which is in direct onomatopoeia, which I think most people would recognize as onomatopoeia, because it's, the sound of the word is emulating a sound. Other words, like, for example, something like trudge, which I think some people might say was onomatopoeic, other people would say wasn't, or, would feel unsure. It's not emulating a sound, but it is emulating a feeling or emotion or emotion, or all of these are what I refer to as kind of mimetic words throughout the book.
The one thing that sort of popped out for me there is onomatopoeia, mimetic language, and English. It sounds like, I don't know if this is the case, but it sounds like in English it's considered a bit more juvenile, where in Japan it has I don't know if you could call it a linguistic status, but it has a kind of status. I don't know if that's fair at all.
Yeah. And this is really fascinating, right? That there are certain areas of Japanese where you find this onomatopoeic, this mimetic language cropping up loads. And one of those is with children's language, children's storybooks, which is the same in English. But in Japanese, there's a far wider application for lots of mimetic language, and it doesn't carry that same infantile connotation. One of the classic times when people might really crowd their language with this mimetic language is in describing something that happened. So let's say you see a video clip and then you're asked to narrate what happened. You know, the man fell off the house and then he slammed into the wall. What, you know, this, and that kind of description in Japanese would typically be crowded with these kinds of mimetic language.
So it's a real way of communication of between. It's a real way to relate or narrate experiences in a way that perhaps English doesn't allow, or we don't utilize, maybe, without getting without getting to a thorny discussion of linguistic determinism relative, and I think because it does skirt those boundaries, doesn't it? And you're in the opening pages, you kind of are negotiating your way around those really quite difficult and some seemingly endless debates about language and how it, you know, relates to the construction of our world, as it were.
Part of the book that I drafted and redrafted the most was definitely the preface. And I think the reason was in order to set up the rest of the book, I needed to give readers, you know, who may not be familiar with Japanese at all, some kind of knowledge around what I was going to be doing. But I also didn't want it to be so involved and so dull that people would kind of fling the book away, or you know, to give them a sense that like this was what the rest of it was going to be like. I sort of wanted, in a way, to give people tools that they could then forget about for the rest of the book, I suppose.
The book isn't about that, is it, really? It's about you and your experiences in Japan, the 50 sounds of real words that are used. I don't know if you could just give us an example of one and talk about how you kind of constructed the narrative out of that.
It's useful to say that the chapter titles for the 50 sounds are quite distinctive. So they take a specific form, which is this particular Japanese word, followed by a very specific and subjective definition, very personal definition, which, you know, in many cases is essentially very wrong. You know, it's not purporting to actually define the word. I think there's a couple actually where I have just quoted directly from an actual Japanese English dictionary, but many of them are not like that at all. And so each of the chapters deals with this particular word, and they all engage with the words in quite different ways. So maybe, like, I'll give an example of a really short, one of the shortest chapters is called Bo, the sound of a ship leaving shore. Chapter titles go, that's a relatively straight up one, and sound of a ship's horn is one of the meanings of Bo. And I kind of talk about the sound of the ship and this vision that I had, knowing that I was going to be leaving the island sort of for the last time, and the kind of the incredible symbolism that it took on. This is just a very small selection, and actually, like, choosing them was really hard.
Yeah.
And that, you know, the lineup, as I was working on the draft, the lineup changed a lot. Like some were there throughout and like related to particular memories that I knew that I wanted to include. You know, and with some of them, like, the link with my experience is very clear and obvious and was easy in that respect. And others, I think it's much more tenuous, and they're linked to kind of more not philosophical ideas so much, but ideas that I was having throughout about language and so on.
Well, what does that mean then to you? Because there is philosophy in there, and you talk a lot about Wittgenstein.
I went to Japan immediately after graduating, and in my final year of my degree, I studied mostly Wittgenstein and was really kind of obsessed with his ideas, specifically later Wittgenstein. And And it's very much about philosophy as a way of moving away from the kind of the idea of the ideal and looking very much at the kind of specifics of experience. And language as a naturally, a messy phenomenon that evolves naturally in societies and communities, and where the meaning is specific to those communities. You know, I was really sold on that as an idea, as a way of thinking about things. But then I really felt like going to Japan and my experiences there just allowed me to experience that in a totally new way, a way that felt like another dimension had been added to it. My lack of familiarity with it just enabled me to see so much more than I could when the subject was English, because, you know, this is another thing that kind of Wittgenstein says, that the more, you know, that essentially familiarity makes us incapable of seeing some of the most basic truths about what's going on, you know. And I think that one of the things that really, being in Japan and experiencing this new language all around me, and also making a real effort to learn Japanese, was just what a kind of embodied process speaking a language is. You know, how I think, because we have the written word, and, you know, particularly within an academic context, like a lot of our focus is on written language and reading, rather than actually spoken communication. So much of what we do is about, so much of the way we interact with one another is about our behavior, our gestures, our, you know, our feelings, and learning the language as well was just such a kind of full body experience, I suppose, and all of the feelings that I was having, it felt like a real roller coaster and a real adventure. This idea from previous philosophers, and which he himself kind of advocated at certain points, that essentially, like, the key to understanding language and the world was to find the kind of pure logic at the heart of the language, you know, to see how actually ridiculous that was in the light of what I was perceiving language to be, and what language learning was revealing itself to be, was really mind-blowing for me. A revelation. I thought I'd had the revelation learning it for the first time, but actually, like, the real revelation came when I went to Japan and experienced that for myself, I suppose.
Wittgenstein. No, I don't know a lot. I'm not an expert on him, but he wrote two, I guess, completed books about his philosophy, the Tractatus and Investigation, wasn't it?
Yeah.
When you start by talking about your education and the kind of some of your lectures you're in, and encountering Wittgenstein philosophy, and I kind of got a sense that, I don't know if dissatisfaction is the right word, but there was something within that experience that you're unfulfilled by, or maybe it was that sense of familiarity, that, you know, you weren't getting whatever it is you wanted to get from this education, as it were. You were certainly getting some things, and obviously it's fantastic education, but just think about that idea of Wittgenstein, because these two works were, I guess, were they confounded of each other? They were very different, weren't they, in what he was proposing? And you talk a lot about errors. I've noticed you talk a lot about errors and education and having space to get things right and wrong. I just wondered if there was something within that then of Wittgenstein that you really did quite, beside the philosophy, that you really took to kind of heart or really quite admired about what he did.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I talk about this a bit in the book. I think I could have talked about it for much longer, but I was also worried with Wittgenstein of putting people up. With the Tractatus, Wittgenstein kind of took the ideas of his predecessors, this idea of this pure logical philosophy, and really carried it to its extreme version. And, at that point when he did it, it was like he wrote a letter to his mentor, Russell, and said, I think I've finally solved all of our problems. I know that sounds...
That'd be Bertrand Russell, wouldn't it?
Bertrand Russell, yeah, sorry. I believe I've solved all of our problems. I've solved philosophy, basically, is what he was saying. And he, I think for a few months, he really believed that, and then started to kind of have these doubts, and these doubts essentially grew and grew and grew and gave way to like a way of looking at the world that felt in many ways opposite to what he expounds in the Tractatus. I mean, I think in other ways there are lots of similarities, but in terms of this kind of the purity and the kind of crystalline nature of the Tractatus versus this huge, like, what the investigation seems to me to be doing a lot of the time is essentially embracing the mess of what we've got in our human language. And what's amazing to me is that he's so open about that as he's writing it, and kind of openly saying, oh, well, I said this in the Tractatus, but I was totally wrong. And, this is using himself and his own philosophy as an example of like how badly wrong you can go and the kind of errors that we're tempted to make. I found that really incredible, and I still find it really incredible and very rare, I think.
Yeah, that's what I wondered if it is, if you believe that is quite a rare trait to
I do think
a scholar to embody.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be crazy to say that Wittgenstein was without ego, because when you read his biography, it's very, very clear that wasn't the case. And anyone listening who hasn't read his biography by Ray Monk should definitely go out and do that, because it's, he had just the most extraordinary life, and he was the most extraordinary character. He said very outrageous things to people on a daily basis. I mean, really, really.
The sound of a ship leaving shore. I saw it all the time, before it happened, after it happened, an event whose symbolic value far exceeded that of its actual happening. The ferry pulling away from the harbour for the last time, with me on it. There would be the whirring of the engines, the smashing of the gong as it pulled away, and then once it was onto the open water, the ferry would let out a deep bellow that seemed to emanate from its very bowels. I don't actually know now if the horn was ever sounded, but this was how I saw it in my head, and that image surpassed everything else. Bo is how you say the sound in Japanese. Spoken, it is very low, half animal and half mechanical. I'd learned it recently and was fixated with it, but even that seemed a meagre approximation of the sound of the ferry as I heard it in my head. That sound resonated forever.
We don't have spaces, do we, I guess, to say, look, I got this wrong, I made an error. Yeah. And it kind of ties into, it seems to be then a bit in language and language use, it seems to be a bit of a minefield. But I'm talking about kind of just some quite very comical, but these can lead to quite sort of visual feelings, can't they? I guess of embarrassment and in some cases, I guess, shame, but and also just moments of true comedy as well.
So that is like behind all of this is this emotion, shame, right? Which I suppose I don't mention by name that often in the book, but I feel like a lot of it is grappling with shame and different kinds of shame, and how that is involved in being in Japan. Often felt like a daily battle with that feeling and sort of staving it off. And there are times when I wonder if, like, basically the only reason I set out to learn Japanese was because I couldn't bear that feeling. I found it so difficult to be making faux pas all the time that it was like, right, I need to overcome this. And of course, I mean, it's a ridiculous thing to do. Like the best solution would be just to give up and go home, or just to refuse to speak Japanese at all.
Well, you feel, this is a thing as well, you feel triumph, we all would, I would, but you feel triumph. And you said it was like a daily battle, and that kind of triumph that you feel comes through as well. And we're kind of reading along and we're going, go on, Polly. We're sort of rooting for you. But either way, you moved to Japan, and you do seem to experience a lot of binaries in the world. There's right and wrong ways to use language. You talk a lot about feeling within the culture and outside the culture and in and out of the language. And then this idea of being immersed and distant.
I think there's a lot to say about this. I think, like, to return to the kind of language learning thing, and again, this is something that Wittgenstein wrote about. I sound like a broken record, but it is that, we so often think about, like, do you speak French? Yes or no? Like, can you read this word? Yes or no? And actually, the reality of that is not a binary, right? It's a spectrum, or not even a spectrum, a kind of 3D field of different things and different abilities. And like, also when I went out to Japan, I was teaching English, and people would ask me questions and place total trust in me because I was a native speaker, and I would be really aware that, like, I wasn't sure about some of these things that I was saying, or that that I would be asked a question and I'd give an answer as best as I could, but I wasn't certain about it. We sort of rely so much on these labels of, like, someone who is, if you are a native speaker, you can do everything that's possible to do within the language. I mean, that's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean? Like,
the word that you use a word at the start, and the word you use quite a bit in there is tools and toolbox. It's as if the language does give you the kind of keys and mechanics to kind of interact with a different kind of language or culture.
Yeah, and I think that then I also experienced that binary again with relationship to, like, inside versus out, like us versus them type thing. Like, when I was in Japan at the beginning, I felt very much an outsider. And I think at a certain point, I started to feel like, I don't really like this feeling anymore. Like, I would like to experience what it's like to be not an outsider anymore. And it was very clear to me that, like, learning the language was the best way to do that. And I did that. And yet the feeling of being an outsider didn't really ever go away. And I think there's various reasons for that. And some of them are, like, to do with my own psychology issues, all of that stuff. And then I think another of them is that, in Japan, like, it is still very hard to see someone who is, like, visibly non-Japanese, and treat them as one of the in crowd, as it were. I think, even people who have lived in Japan for kind of 30 years and have children out there and, are so fully fluent and so embedded in the culture kind of often report a similar type of experience, I think. And that's interesting to me as a phenomenon. I mean, I think that obviously like that exists within British society as well, but its contours are different, right?
You talked about Japan being in this full body experience, and particularly the ideas, and then we've spoken about being in and out of the culture, feel like an outsider. How then does this idea of immersion relate to that?
I think for me, the easiest way that I can think of to describe what immersion means for me is having no escape. You know, I think that to define immersion as there being no escape is obviously like makes it sound extremely bleak. But I think that it was really helpful for me because it just made me feel like I need to learn this. I need to understand what is going on around me. And I suppose ultimately it comes down to this question of choice, right? It's like it's not a thing of choosing to log on to Duolingo or to go to a Japanese course and then kind of step out of the lesson. It's really feeling like this is all that there is around me, and so that obviously it was a decision to learn Japanese, but it felt like a psychological necessity.
And it's really interesting because, I mean, immersion could. They always say, don't they, that immersion is the best way to learn a language. You know, gap years, things like that, spend some time abroad. But immersion, it's interesting you talk about it not totally being a pleasant experience. But immersion, it's an experience some people seek. And you say immersion is what happened to me. You know, it wasn't whether or not it was a choice. Either way, sometimes it didn't seem to feel like a choice. And I don't know where this imagery comes from of forests and sort of feeling your way through. I got a kind of way, there was a kind of you were trying to feel your way through this environment, and you can see so far into the distance, sort of groping at branches and moving them out of the way. But there is a specific. We'll come back to Duolingo itself, but there is a game that you play, a language game, isn't there? Slime Forest, and it's these two words. As soon as you wrote these, I couldn't help but kind of notice other instances of where it sounded like either slime or forest, and they kind of converged into. And I don't know if this represented anything about this idea of being immersed.
That's so fascinating. I'd not thought about it, the symbolic value of slime forests, but it's really true, and slime does come up in other aspects. A forest in that you can't get out, and slime in that it's like all over you, and I really like that. But it wasn't. I mean, slime forest was just the name for this game that I was playing to learn the Japanese alphabet. You'd have to speak to the game creator and ask him what his deal was.
Well, either way, it seems to relate this idea you spoke about at the start about mess, and that ties into errors. But there's something messy about the world and language, and perhaps being immersed in. Get a way how to navigate that.
Mess is a big theme of this book. In earlier drafts, when I was writing about Wittgenstein and trying to kind of find a way of bringing him into the story, there was more talk about his psychology and his experience of mess and being a mess and how that related to me.
Well, I mean, the structure is really important, isn't it, to the book? And the way that the book is structured, you don't get a sense of what really the book is going to be, because you do talk about, experiences, and you don't really get a sense of. Ultimately, I thought it was kind of, it was a memoir effectively. I thought it was a piece of really brilliantly effective life writing, and you don't get a sense of time or anything like that. It's such an imagistic experience as very much kind of within the kind of, I don't know if this is how if you intended to do that, but you place us in, I guess you immerse us in the moment with yourself. And I just don't know if there's any particular experiences that happened to you in Japan that you might want to talk about. The kind of, people you meet and some of the kind of perhaps the more immersive experiences.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. I really am glad to hear that. And I think what I wanted to do with this book was really hone in on the absolute particulars of language learning, and that, the very specific things, personal experiences, as a kind of portal to accessing something that was universal in a way, because the universal thing is these particular unique experiences. And it took me a while to sort of realize, a whirl of like writing it and kind of figuring it out, that I really needed to go very granular, and very kind of personal, and to talk quite openly about like various things, mistakes that I made, like ways that I was an idiot, things that I now look back on and think, oh my God, falling in love, having like bad sex. And I think that, so many people have said to me with respect to language learning, like, oh, I only learned German because I met a German guy and we fell in love, or whatever, these kind of very, very unique experiences. But at some point I sort of realized that I'd heard so many people saying things that I had chats with people at parties about those things, but nobody was really writing about that stuff, or they were writing about it as a romance, but something so distinct to language and the language learning experience. And I think what I really wanted to do was make it clear that all of those like aspects of experience in life that we might think are unglamorous or like too personal are themselves a part of learning a language and learning a culture, and maybe the most important part in a way. And so I felt like, even if it was embarrassing to have my dad and potential clients and all of these, people reading my book, reading these particular descriptions, that it was something that I needed to do to make it work.
You speak at times about, you see Japan as a man, I think is the way you put it. And there is something in here about relationships. And obviously you have a relationship when you're in Japan with, we call him Y. And there's something about, and you talk about John Bowlby and the attachment theory. I think is there something in here then about, because you do talk about, as you said, instances about your relationships that you have. Is there something in here about relationships as well? What is this really a part of it, a way to kind of get closer to that?
It's the easy answer. I mean, I think that yes, it is, because again, like it comes back for me at least to this very embodied view of language, I think, and language that doesn't really exist in the abstract. It only exists between people and within relationships, right? And I think I was particularly conscious of that when I was in Japan. I was really conscious of, my relationship to Japanese and how it was made up of all these kind of individual interactions, but also sort of took on its own holism in a sense. I used to have so I was in a relationship with this person, Y, and I used to have, really ask myself, like, do I like him, or am I in love with him, or am I just in love with Japanese? And there would be days when I didn't.
Wow, cracky.
Which is ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. Looking back, it's like, of course I was in love with him, but it was so new. This Japanese thing was so new that I didn't quite know how it all fitted in. I don't know. I suppose what I'm trying to say is, and this is Wittgenstein, when you are speaking a language that you are totally fluent in, it becomes totally invisible to you, right? Whereas in Japan, the language itself was so visible, and I was so obsessed with it that I think at times like that became more visible to me than the people who were speaking it, or I wasn't sure how to separate them all out. It was all just a mess.
I think, yeah, well, it's difficult, isn't it? I think I get that question of do I love Japan or do I love this man? I guess it's kind of putting things in. I guess it's you're putting things in categories, I guess, and it's difficult questions. And love, perhaps love and language is quite closely related because they're kind of very unquantifiable phenomena, and so kind of close to the body as well. It's not always, we can't quantify what's going on sometimes, I don't think. And I thought that's what the book spoke about as well. We can't quantify or classify or qualify all our experiences in language.
Yeah, we can't quantify them. And I think that I wanted to write about the experiences that weren't linguistically quantifiable, a lot of the time. And I don't know, which I suppose is why it had to be quite imagistic or quite kind of novelistic in some ways,
Yeah.
I think that I've never really worked with like constraints in this way before. And a lot of people talk about how writing under a certain constraint can be really helpful. And although the concept of this book sounds quite crazy, maybe, or intricate or arcane, as my mother once put it, when it's described, like I think once I was kind of running with it, like it was so helpful. And one of the reasons that it was so helpful was that I think there's a real variety of different experiences that I talk about in this book, and a lot of them pull in totally different directions. Like I'm so in love with Japanese and everything about it one moment, and I really hate it the next, and felt so frustrated and so full of shame, all of this stuff. And that feels very true to my experience, and I wanted to get that across. But at the same time, I think if it had just been one long essay, I would have, or not had the structure that it did, I would have felt too crazy to sort of describe it in that way, or just too, like, there wasn't enough of a through line. And I think having these 50 different essays gave me the freedom to sort of really go off in one direction for one bit, and then, but not feel bound to then kind of backtrack on that with the other bits, just to say in one bit, like, I'm feeling really frustrated, I hate this language, and then in the next one be like, I love this language, and not to kind of have to find the sum total of them. And I think in the end, I'm quite pleased with, I feel like if you were to put this book in a blender, the juice that comes out is like a close representation of how I do feel about Japan. And that feels like something that, like, it was a balance, but in the end, I kind of got.
Yeah, so interesting. And I guess it does provide a way then for you to quantify experience. There is, it's a numerical title, isn't it? 50 Sounds. It is a fantastic book, and we can't wait to see where you go next. Winner of the Fitzcarraldo 2020 Essay Prize, 50 Sounds. Thank you very much for joining me, Polly.
Thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, Series 2, Episode 1, done and dusted. Join me next time when I'm going to be joined by Kalisa Ray, the American poet, who's going to be talking about her first collection, Ghost in a Black Girl's Throat. Until then, please give the Rippling Pages podcast social media pages a follow at Rippling_pages. That's both on Twitter and Instagram. And if you want to get in touch, please give us an email at ripplingpagespod@gmail.com. Until then, thank you for listening.